It was the third inmate that week we'd found dead in his cell. Inmate deaths aren't exactly uncommon in a prison setting. Some guys realize this is going to be their life, and they decide to end it. Some people run afoul of a criminal element, and they pay the price. Some people are just placed in a cell with the wrong person, and when they snap hard. Edward Wargrave appeared to be one of the former. He had cut himself from ear to ear, and he died with the most fulfilled look of joy on his face. His cellmate had woken up to discover him like this, face down on his bunk and cold as a block of ice. When we had rolled the doors at 4:30 a.m. for breakfast, he'd been sitting on the top bunk, shaking as his roommate lay in a pool of congealing blood. I was currently standing in the cell with the inspection team, such as it was. Captain Darvin, my shift supervisor, the Inspector General, a beefy man named Halk, the Assistant Warden, Clive, and myself. Clive was acting as the Warden's representative in this matter, and his enthusiasm was a little creepy. Most Assistant Wardens would have hung back and taken notes, but Clive seemed to want to stay close enough to smell the man's last meal. I saw Halk move him out of the way several times so that he and the captain could get a better look at the body. It was Halk's job to do a formal inspection, and the Weasley little man was clearly getting on his nerves. Clive was a new addition to the staff, and no one really seemed to like him. He was thin to the point of emaciation, a fact that was not helped by his height. The man was about 5 feet tall, and even that height was gained on tiptoe sometimes. He had a pinched face and an unfortunate nose that looked more concave than anything. He seemed to delight in any sort of suffering that he could find, and he already had a reputation with the inmates as someone best avoided. I yawned, already ready to be done with this. It was 4:45 in the morning, and I already knew there would be another 3 hours of paperwork for something like this. I had been acting as Security 9, a position directly under the captain, for about 6 months now. It's not a bad gig, mostly a lot of paperwork and running around. You're the captain's right hand in many ways, and you often act as his representative on matters. You're also responsible for making sure that everything runs smoothly on the compound, which can sometimes be a little daunting. After several years of working as an officer, it wasn't too overwhelming a task, and I took to it quickly. The strange deaths didn't start happening until recently. 5 inmates in the last month and a half had been found in their cells. They had all committed suicide, cutting their throats from ear to ear, before dying with the most profound look of happiness on their face. All of them were different, and there was no real pattern to any of them. The first one had been a young guy, only here about 6 months, while Wargrave was a lifer who had been incarcerated for the last 15 years. The other 3 had ran the gambit somewhere in the middle, and there was no gang affiliation or demographic to connect any of them. The warden was keeping it all very hush-hush from the outside world, which was why we were investigating it. Keep it inside the gate was our general MO 90% of the time, especially after the Captain Peterson incident. Halk was talking to Wargrave's cellmate. The little man was beside himself, blubbering and talking very fast about how he had been asleep, and the officer had just seen him an hour ago snoring, so he couldn't have been the one to do this. The kid was all of 22 and doing a short sentence for battery. He did not want to get more time, or get hemmed up over some nonsense, like his cellmate killing himself. As they loaded Wargrave onto the stretcher, his arm flopped out bonelessly. That's how I noticed the new tattoo. The skin around the word Jesse was red and angry looking. Prison tattoos are rarely particularly beautiful, and are a great way to get a nasty case of hepatitis if you're lucky. This one, however, was exceptionally inflamed looking. It almost looked as though someone had branded him, as opposed to just marking his skin with ink. I mentioned it to the inspector, and he nodded, saying they would make a note of it on his chart, since they were supposed to keep track of any new tattoos. Then the stretcher left with Wargrave, and the captain and I returned to the office to start paperwork. I didn't think about the tattoo again until a couple of days later, as I was directing inmates to chow. I was directing D-Dorm towards the chow hall, when we were stopped by a group returning from the chow hall. You didn't want to let them get too close to each other if you could help it. That was usually how drugs got exchanged or people got stabbed. So I stopped them at the corner and let the new group go on ahead, turning left as they headed for their dorm. As I stood there, I noticed a familiar tattoo on the first man's arm and squinted at it. It was fresh, the arm still inflamed looking. It had the same look Wargraves had. The ink was possessed of an almost burnt look. It looked as though someone had gently branded him with the name Jesse, the name done in cursive. The squiggles supposed to look cute, I supposed. There was nothing cute about the tattoo, though. It looked painful, like it would itch and be very uncomfortable. It seemed that this Jesse would never be far from his mind, or the attention of his dirty fingernails. Inmate, and as he looked up, I realized that I knew this one. Myers, when'd you get that new ink? Myers, a scrawny white boy in his early 30s who had never really lost that look of 16, looked at me almost guiltily. Tattooing in prison is an offense that can get you put in confinement, and failure to give up your artist is just as bad. Of course, tattling on your tattoo artist is a great way to get stabbed, so most choose to go to the box instead. Myers made to cover the tattoo, but seemed to think better of it. I'd seen it, so there was no use pretending it didn't exist. He slumped a little and looked about shiftily before responding. "Just the name of my girl, Sarge." I gave him a mistrustful look. "That's not fresh ink, is it?" He shook his head dumbly, and about that time the line began to move. I let him go, not wanting to hold up chow over a new tattoo, but I made a note of it to check on him later. 2 inmates with the same name on them was a little suspicious. At least, that's what I thought at the time. We concluded chow, getting everyone packed back in, and then I went to the captain's office to start my evening work. Honestly, I would have probably forgotten about the tattoos completely, if it weren't for the paperwork that Captain Darvan dropped on my desk at 9 o'clock that night. He had a haggard look these days. These inmate deaths were really starting to get to him. Brass was on his ass about finding out why so many inmates were committing suicide, and he really wanted to tell them something substantial. "I've got to finish typing up my reports for the Wargrave suicide. Could you go through these and make sure everything looks right? I've been through them so many times that the words are starting to run together. I think a fresh set of eyes might be just what I need." I told him I would, and I pulled the files over. I hadn't really been doing anything anyway, just reviewing count slips and going over our logs to make sure they had been turned in this morning. Going over this busy work would be just what I needed to kill the time until the 11 o'clock count came up, and it was time to count these guys yet again. It wasn't until I had started going through the second file that I noticed something scribbled on the front under defining marks. Someone had written Jesse under tattoos in a thick, blocky script. The location was inmate Cohen's neck, and the word Jesse jumped out at me like a ghost in a funhouse. I switched back to the first file, an inmate named Clark, and looked over defining marks to find that he also had a tattoo that read Jesse. This one had been on his calf, but the coincidence was just too much to overlook. I fumbled through the following 3 files, seeing all 5 inmates with Jesse tattoos on some part of their body. They had all been handwritten, meaning that they were likely fresh ink, and the fact that all of them had been written in seemed to indicate that these were not something they had come to prison with. It was all just a little too weird to overlook as circumstance. I brought it to the captain's attention, but he cut me off and told me to just file the paperwork. I've got enough on my plate without worrying about whatever goddamn thing inmates are getting tattooed on themselves. Just get it done, or I'll find someone else that can and maybe give them your post. Captain Darvan was clearly feeling the squeeze, and I couldn't hold his outburst against him. So I finished the paperwork and told him I'd take it down to the inspector's office and put it in his box. He waved me off and said to hurry back because it would be count time in about 30 minutes. I took the load of files and went to the admin hallway to drop them off. As I left the captain's office, I couldn't help but get a prickle on the nape of my neck as I stood in the shadow of the warden's tower. He had moved his office to that old rat-infested place, and many of us felt like he had taken up residence there. You could see him sometimes on the catwalk as he walked around the tower, just staring at people. It was damn creepy, the warden himself being damn creepy too. This was not something I would have shared with anyone, because you never knew when the warden was watching, or what he might hear. He had been at Stragview for a long, long time, and sometimes firing people wasn't the worst thing he could do. People had disappeared and never been seen again. Some of them had been seen again, and that was almost worse. I hurried across the yard so as not to linger under his supposed sight, and was soon in the admin hallway. I had expected to put the files in the inspector's box that sat on the wall outside his office. To my surprise, though, the light was on and the door was open. Inspector Halk sat at his desk, one big hand resting against his head as he dozed. The last few weeks had been hell for him too. 5 dead inmates, even those dead at their own hands, was hard to explain on paperwork. He was clearly getting the squeeze from someone higher up as well, and not having any luck figuring it out. He jerked awake when I knocked, and told me to come in. I set the files on his desk, telling him they were from Captain Darvin. He thanked me and said he would get right on them. I started to leave right then and there, but I turned on a whim and asked him if he'd noticed the tattoos. He blinked at me and asked me what I was talking about, offering me a seat. I pointed out to him that all 5 inmates had Jesse tattooed on them in a relatively fresh sort of way. They had all been recently marked with that name, and then they had all died. I wasn't sure what it meant, but it seemed a little too convenient to me. Halk raised an eyebrow. You gunning for my job or something? I told him at the moment it didn't look like much fun, and he laughed, telling me to show him what I was talking about. I opened up the case files and showed him the hastily scrawled tattoo descriptions on a few of them. He nodded and said that was weird, but not the weirdest thing he'd ever seen. He thanked me for the information, saying that it did tie them all together somehow. That was when I told him about the inmate I'd seen with a fresh tattoo, and he perked up a bit. Do you mind coming with me to see him? If he has the same tattoo, he might have some information on this. If this isn't one big coincidence, that is. I told him I didn't mind at all, and we set out for D-Dorm to get inmate Myers. We came in through the side door and nodded at the guard in the booth, approaching and telling her quietly that we were here to see inmate Myers. She pointed me to a bunk towards the back, and the other inmates parted as we approached. Like most open bay dorms, D-Dorm is set up like a bunkhouse. There are lots of bunk beds with footlockers in front of them, and about 150 men sleep across 2 similar sides. Myers was set near the fire door towards the end of the bunkhouse, but his bed was empty when we arrived. I asked some of the others, and one of them told me that he had went to the bathroom. He was acting kind of weird, just suddenly got up and walked to the bathroom like someone in a dream. We beat feet to the bathroom and found Myers sitting on the toilet. He was fully clothed, with his head down and his hands in his lap. I thought for a moment that he might be praying, but he was dead silent and seemed to have taken no notice of us. Myers, the inspector wants a word with you. You aren't in any trouble. He just wants to talk to you about some things. Myers didn't move. Come on, Myers, don't make a scene. I told you you're not in any trouble. The man just... But that's when I put a hand on his shoulder and noticed how still he was. As if from my touch, he fell over. His head hit the tile wall of the bathroom stall, and that was when his throat began to bleed. We were suddenly in a pool of blood, and Myers was staring sightlessly at the opposite wall beneath the urinal. Captain Darvin was less than pleased to get a call about yet another inmate suicide. He was even less pleased to discover Inspector Halk and I were already there. I told you not to go sticking your nose into this, Darvin whispered roughly to me as we stood outside the dorm. I told you just to go deliver files and leave this alone. If you can't follow orders, don't chastise your officer for showing some initiative, Halk rumbled, walking out of the dorm and glowering at Darvin. If he hadn't mentioned it, I wouldn't have put 2 and 2 together. He deserves a commendation, not a dressing down. Captain Darvin looked a little put out about being spoken to in such a way, but he grunted and stalked away, as Halk and I stood outside the dorm and talked about what would come next. Fortunately, the answer seemed to find us. As we stood making plans outside the dorm, someone tapped on the window and looked out at the 2 of us. It was an inmate, someone I recognized. Sullivan held up an angry red tattoo on his arm as we stared back at him. Like Myers, the tattoo looked more like a burn than fresh ink. Sullivan's eyes told us all we needed to know, and I could see that Halk had come to the same conclusion. The man was scared and was willing to break the code of silence in order to make this fear go away. We took Sullivan down to the inspector's office and told him to tell us all that he knew. He was hesitant at first. They all are, but when their own safety is at stake, they'll usually spill their guts. So, I was asleep about 3 nights ago when my dream was interrupted by this girl. A girl? I asked skeptically. In here? Not precisely. I was having a dream I've had before. The time I robbed the bank that landed me in here. In real life, it had all went south pretty bad, and in the dream, it was going even worse. The cops had machine guns and rocket launchers, and they was blowing us up, and really just making a mess out of it. I was hunkered behind the teller desk, clutching my automatic pistol and just praying to God to make it all go away. Then I look up, and there's this girl standing in front of me. She says if I wanted it all to go away, she could help. She said she can make everything better, and all I have to do is take her hand. I'm guessing she wasn't there on the day in question, Halk asked. If she had been, I guess I wouldn't be doing 25 to life, Sullivan said. "You jokers want to hear the rest of the story, or you want to keep interrupting me?" We both nodded to him to continue, and he went on. "So I take her hands. Why not? It's just a dream after all. And then it felt like my arm was on fire. The flames seemed to creep over my forearm, and I tried to pull them away from her. But her grip was like iron, and she just held me there as her smile got wider and wider. Then she turned my arm over, and I could see the name that was printed there. The name Jessie looked like it had been branded into me, and she said that I belonged to her now. She also said that she'd be back for what was hers later." "Then what happened?" I asked. "I woke up and saw that her name was on me. That's when I realized that it might have been a little more than a dream. That's when Myers approached me, showing me his own markings. He said that Jessie had come to him in a dream as well, saying that she could help him escape his current situation. There were quite a few of them, actually, 8 or 9, but now I guess there might only be a couple of us." I asked him for the names of the ones that were left, but he refused to tell. "You know what happens to snitches in here. They'll have to come forward on their own, but I need your help now. After Myers, I was the first one to get my brand. Everyone before Myers is dead now, and I'm afraid that I'm going to be next. I need help, and I'll gladly say whatever you need me to say so that this Jessie doesn't get me." Halk signed the orders right then and there, and we put him under surveillance. We had him in an isolation cell down in medical, telling them that he was a witness to the murders that had been happening on the compound. Halk put me on duty that first night, watching him and sitting with him, but nothing happened. I watched the second night as well, and the night after that. I came in on my off days to sit with him, and on the 5th day, something finally happened. I was drowsing. 5 days of 12-hour shifts will do that to you, and I had already decided that tomorrow I would let someone else take this for a night or two. It was about 2 a.m. when my chair threatened to spill me over, and I realized I'd been sleeping. I looked up into the small room where we were keeping him, and saw that Sullivan wasn't alone in there. Someone was standing over him, and as they stroked his thinning hair, he shuddered in his sleep. I was speechless for a moment, unsure of what to do. The woman was tall and thin to the point of gauntness. Her long silver hair hung down in front of Sullivan's face. As it touched him, he shuddered violently. Then she bent down and pressed her lips to his ear, whispering to him and telling him something he didn't seem to want to hear. His eyes snapped open suddenly, and the pupils had become black and staring like a doll's eyes. I was up and banging on the glass, asking her just what the hell she thought she was doing in there. She smiled at me, her lips pulled back in a feral grin that made my testicles pull up into my chest. It was a decidedly cannibalistic sort of grin, the sort of grin that hinted she might come after me once she had finished with him. Sullivan had gotten to his feet, looking around the little room as if trying to figure out what to do. There were no weapons here, no bunks to hang yourself from, no ledges to jump from, but he seemed to have found something nonetheless. He lowered his head and began to run at the wall, intent on breaking his neck. I stepped up to the door, pushing the key in the lock and trying to make it open. The key stopped about halfway around though, not wanting to connect and open the door. I bent over the key, trying to make my weight force it open, but the more I pushed, the more the key groaned and threatened to break. I began to panic, not knowing what to do. They would never believe that some ghost woman had broken in and killed Sullivan. They would think that he had decided to kill himself, and I had simply sat here and watched it happen. Then a pair of strong hands encircled mine, taking the keys and pushing me aside. I looked up and realized it was the warden. He was smiling down at me with that slightly serpentine face of his, and as he pushed me against the wall, ever so gently, he told me not to move and just to stand. Then he proceeded into the isolation cell, and I was treated to the sound of Sullivan nearly cracking his skull on the wall as he ran a second time. The woman, I suppose she was Jessie, looked up at him with something like terror mixed with curiosity. I couldn't see what lay in the warden's eyes, since he had his back to me, but she began to back away as he forced her into a corner. Her face still looked as a predator's must when faced with a larger predator, unsure if they can share the food, or if the larger one means to have it all, and them as well. Then, as the warden finally pinned her to the corner, she began to scream, and I placed my hands over either side of my head as I tried to muffle that piercing sound. I could feel it vibrate in my bones, hear it wavering over my senses, and I felt that I must surely shatter if I was forced to endure it for much longer. I slid to the ground, surprised not to feel blood running through my fingers, and put my head between my knees as I prayed for it to end. It seemed my prayers were answered, because the screaming abruptly stopped. I looked up to see the warden towering over me, Sullivan lying on the floor as his head bled and his neck bruised. The warden just smiled, and I became afraid that he would silence me as easily as he had Jesse. I would suggest that you call medical ASAP. It would appear that inmate Sullivan has had a psychotic break and will need some medical attention. I won't tell anyone about your nap on the floor, so long as you don't mention anything about Mr. Sullivan's nighttime visitor. Agreed? I nodded dumbly, and he patted my head, his strange, scaly fingers rasping over my hair. He started walking away then, but stopped suddenly, and left me with one more thing to ponder before returning to his tower. Please tell Inspector Hulk that the situation we spoke of earlier has been taken care of. If there's one thing I can't stand in this world, it's a fucking poacher. Then he left, and I was forced to call medical and get Sullivan some help. Sullivan had nearly cracked his skull, and his neck was badly bruised where he had wrenched it against the wall. He would spend the next few weeks in medical, to be sure, and Hulk sent me home to get some rest. When I told him what the warden had said, privately, of course, he went a little pale and just nodded. He said he didn't want any details. He didn't want to know what had happened. He just told me to go get some sleep. Laying here awake, however, trying to forget what I saw, is a little harder than expected. I watched the warden, a man who signs my checks and commands the respect of nearly every warm body on the compound, kill what I suspect was a restless spirit. The more I try to puzzle it out, the more questions I seem to discover. The longer I lay here, trying to make sense of it all, the more I wonder what will happen to those men marked by Jesse, who still live on the compound. The longer I think about it, the more I think it might be time to take that vacation I've been putting off. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thanks so much for joining me for tonight's story. I hope you guys are enjoying 2 Stragview stories this week. That's quite a treat. I hope you're also enjoying our Padre Gray stories. I think there's another 2 or 3, maybe? I don't know. I'll have to touch base with the writer and see how many more he's got. I've really been enjoying his work, and I hope that you have too. Let's go ahead and thank our patrons before we leave for the night. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor, and Janet for also being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, ladies. We just couldn't do it without you. Also, thanks to Glenn Jenkins for being our Ghost Rider tier contributor. Thanks, Glenn. Your patronage means so much. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you too can be one of our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors and have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I do. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.